In this video, we're going to look at higher order components. Higher order components allow you to give functionality from one component to another. So you can extend the functionality of one component to another. You may have seen in earlier projects that use React, the mix-in, which kind of does something similar. And it's something I'm not going to cover in this tutorial because it's being depreciated in React from version 0.13, I believe. So from there onwards, higher order components are what are going to be used to give extra functionality to your components. Now, higher order components take a component as an argument. They then add functionality to that component and then return the component with the added functionality to it. You can kind of think of it as a container, and whatever you pass into that container gets certain properties and abilities added to it and then passes it out. The problem that higher order components solve is writing too much boilerplate code. Now, other JavaScript frameworks, such as Es6, use a lot of magic behind the scenes, and they give you a lot of things pre-built. So you'll have a lot of button components already pre-built, so you don't have to do them yourselves. Whereas React says you have to build everything you want, and you can build it however you want. So you can imagine if you've got a big application, you're going to use a lot of buttons, a lot of input boxes, etc. And you don't want to create that component every time you need it. So what you can do is create a single component, a base component, and then extend that component. So you might have a base button component that has the ability to increment the count. And then you may say, I want a button that can have its count incremented, or a label, a div, and you may want to have the count be incremented on a single click, on a double click, perhaps on a mouse over. Higher order components allow you to do this. So you write one base component and then you extend that base component to give the functionality that you want. It's time to build our higher order component. I'm going to start off by building our base components. Higher order components are just functions. And we define our function using the let keyword and then the name of our function, which is going to be the base count. It's going to be a simple component that allows you to increment the count, which is going to live on the state of the base count component. You're going to be able to increment the count through whatever event you like. So a click event, a double click event, a mouse over, a mouse on, and you'll be able to use this on whatever kind of component you want. So it could be a button, an image, a label, a div, whatever you like. With the name of our base component created, we are going to assign it to a function. This is going to be an array function, which we've seen before. Now, with an array function, the function we are going to pass is our class. So we're going to extend React.component. We know that if you use an array function, you have a new function created from it, and that you can pass in arguments. And we're going to pass in a basic component. The basic component that we are passing in, so the argument we're passing in, is going to be the component we want to extend. So the component we want to have extra functionality on. Our base count component is going to have all the functionality we want to give to our basic component. And our base count is simply a function that returns a component with the argument of basic component. So it's a function. That's all it is. It's just a function that returns a component, and that component has another component within it because we're passing it in as an argument. As with all components, we are going to implement a render method. In our render method, we are going to return a div. I'm going to give this div a class name of container. I've got my style sheet included for the class names for the styling, just to make it look a little bit nicer. Close that div off. Now within this div, we are going to return our basic component. Let's go ahead and do that now. And close that off. You can see here that all we're doing is returning a div with our basic component. So whenever we call the base count function, and it is a function, whatever argument we pass to that is going to be returned as a component. With our higher order component complete, although very basic but complete, we can actually start to use it. Now, at the moment, it's not going to add any extra functionality to the component we pass to it, but it's going to work. And this is a good time to show you just exactly what's going on without too much extra to confuse you. What I'm going to do is just use the React DOM library to render, and I'm going to pass in just a blank component for the moment, so nothing will get rendered. And of course, document.get element by ID and the ID of app. Okay. At the moment, we're not calling the base count function, and it is a function. It's a function that takes a basic component argument and returns a React component with the basic component contained within it. What we're going to do is create a stateless functional component to pass to our base count higher order component. To create our stateless functional component, as we've seen before, we are simply going to assign the constant button to an arrow function, and the arrow function is simply going to return a button. I'm going to give this button a class name of button blue btn, and we'll just say I am a button. Close it off. We now have two components. We have a stateless functional component and a higher order component. We actually need to pass our stateless functional component to our higher order component. To do that, we simply declare the name of the new component we want. So I'm going to call this extended button because we're going to be extending this button, and we'll assign it to the base count function with our button component passed to it. If you think about what's going on here, we're calling the base count function, this function here, which equals a React component. So whenever this function gets called, it's simply going to return a React component, a React class. And we're passing in a basic component argument, passing in a button, a stateless functional component. So you can imagine that this component is being passed in like so. Bit confusing, but don't worry. And then that component is simply being returned in the render method. So you can imagine that rather than basic component, it's just our button that's being returned. So let's go ahead and render our extended button to the DOM. If we save this, open up the document in your browser, you'll see we have our button. All we've done is pass our stateless functional component to the higher order component, which just renders it. Doing this alone isn't at all useful because we're not actually adding any extra functionality to our button. To do this, we need to add the extra functionality, and we're going to do that on our basic component. In our base count function, we're going to call a constructor, because this is a React class, and we'll pass in our props. Of course, we need to call super, and we'll pass in the props to super as well. Also going to set some state. So this.state equals an object of count, and we'll set that to 0. I'm also going to implement our increment count method. This is the method that's going to get passed to our new component, to the component we want to extend, so to our button. And of course, this increment count is simply going to set a new state of count to this.state.count plus 1. All we're going to do now is pass our increment to the new component. So on the property increment, we're going to have this.increment count, which of course we need to bind to the component. This.increment count equals this.increment count.bind to this. All we're doing here is passing in the increment property to the component that gets passed in to our base component. So any component that we pass to the base count function will now get passed an increment property, which is a function. If we go ahead and console.log props, which of course we now need to pass into our stateless functional component, props. So we're now passing in the increment prop to the property and console.logging it in our button. We should see we get a function, an increment property, which is a function. Save this, back to your browser, refresh, no errors, open up your developer tools, and you see we get an object. Increment, which is a function. You can see that now our stateless functional component button has been extended to include the increment count function. This component has been passed to the base count component. It's gone through it, it's been rendered, and it's also had the increment count added to it. So we can now use the increment method on our button component. We can now actually start to use our increment method on our button. If I go ahead and just do console.log I have been clicked in our increment count method, we'll be able to use it in our button because it's being passed in as a props, being passed in as an increment prop. So if we say onClick equals props.increment, we should be able to see I have been clicked logged to the console. If you open up your browser, refresh, we've got our button. If we click it, I have been clicked. What we've done here is we've passed the increment count method and the functionality that it brings to another component. So we've extended this component to have functionality from another component, which is great. Go ahead and delete the I have been clicked. We're now going to pass in state to our basic component. Let's pass it in on the count property. So count equals this.state.count. Go ahead and delete I am a button. Replace it with count props.count. Of course, we're passing in the count property to our component, and it equals this.state.count. Now, when we click the button, we're going to increment the count, and that's going to get passed back to our stateless functional component, and we'll see the count increment. Save, refresh your browser. You'll see our count is 0. Click, it's now 1. Click, it's now 2. Click again, it's 3. So we've extended our button component. We've given it an on-click event. But it could be any kind of event we want. It could be on double click, on mouse over. And we've given it a method from another component, which is brilliant. So we can extend components now, which is great. You'll notice that this count isn't very clean. There is a way we can actually make this a lot simpler with Es6. If you delete the count equals this.state.count, we can actually pass it in a much simpler way using Es6. So it's called the spread operator, and you do triple dot this.state. And what this does is it passes in anything that lives on the state object. So it passes in the state. If we save this, refresh, we should have the component working exactly the same, which is what we'd expect. And if we add another state property, so text, hello, this will also get passed, and we'll see it logged to the console. So all this is doing is it's passing any property that is on our state to the component. So it is essentially doing count equals this.state.count, text equals this.state.text. It's just an easier way to do it. Because you can imagine if you've got 100 things on your state, you don't want to do this for every single one. So you can use the Es6 Spread Operator, which is great. I mentioned that you can extend your component to do more than just on-click events. So you can do whatever kind of event you want, and you can extend it to whatever you want. Let's do that with a label. Go ahead and create another stateless functional component. So const, call this one just label, nice and simple. And again, we'll pass in an arrow function with the props, and we'll simply return a label, and we'll do on mouse move equals props.increment, and we will say count, of course, equals props.count label. So we'll be able to see that we can extend a different component to have the same functionality. But this time, when we move our mouse over it, we'll see the count increment. I'm going to go ahead and just replace the button here with label. So we're now not extending our button component. Save it, refresh your browser. So you've got our count. If you mouse over it, the count increases, which is brilliant. Now, if you want to extend both of these stateless functional components, we're going to need to extend them in another component. So we're going to need to pass both of these components to another component and render them from there. Change this back to button, and we'll copy this line because we're going to extend our label. So change that to label. And then we're simply going to use a component. So we'll call this container, which of course extends React.component. And we're going to render And we're simply going to return a div. And this div is simply going to contain a button, an extended button, and an extended label. Now, if we render our container, we'll see, oh, I've spelt extended incorrectly. Just change that quickly. Refresh, we'll see we get both the label and the button, and they both have the same functionality. So they're both using the increment count method, but they're implementing it in different ways. So on mouse move and on click. Now, because we should always use stateless functional components, I'm actually just going to refactor our class component container to be a stateless functional component, as we don't need it to be a class. So const container equals an arrow function. Just remove your render method. Save, refresh, and it all works exactly the same. If it doesn't need state, don't make it a class. Just use a stateless functional component like this. And that's higher order components, giving one component extra abilities from another component. So giving another component the ability to increment the count or whatever kind of method you want to give it. It's a pretty difficult concept to get used to just learning the theory. The more you actually apply it, the easier it will get and the more you'll understand it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you've got any comments, suggestions, or ideas for videos, leave them in the comments below. Send me a tweet at Codewithtim or send me an email, codewithtim@gmail.com.